Thank you, Sue, very much for joining this conversation. I have enjoyed your book very much. I read it with great pleasure. But your life is also worth a book about your family history is very interesting also, yeah, I can mention your that your grandmother was mused to the explorer Roald Amundsen, and your godmother was painted by Edvard Munch, whose biography you later wrote. Are there some things that you want to explain to yourself while writing your biographies? Is there some kind of analysis involved? Some wish to see the truth?
Thank you, Kaspar, and thank you very much for doing this interview with me. I want to thank Agnes too for inviting me to talk at the Klaipėda Book Festival. And I'd also like to thank my publisher, actually, Yotema, if that is how you pronounce it, and my translator. It cannot have been an easy book to translate. Of course, I don't know how well he did it. I'm sure he did it beautifully. I can't tell. But thank you, everybody. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to be taking part in this festival with you. Lovely. I'm honored. Kasprasi, you mentioned my Norwegian heritage and the connection with Roald Amundsen, who was very much in love with my grandmother, and the painter Edvard Munch. And there were family connections to Munch. And before I became a biographer, I was an art historian. I wrote a lot about art, but I also wrote about novels. But I soon realized that really nothing I could make up was half so interesting as writing about real lives. And so then that really, when I wanted to find out more about Edvard Munch, that was when I wrote my first biography, taking him as the subject, and of course, having a rather special access to his writings and work and so on. And I very much enjoyed doing that. And so then my next biography was of his great friend, August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright. And of course, both of them were enormously influenced by Nietzsche's thought. And so I thought, ooh, shall I be brave and do Nietzsche? And it seemed, at first, I only wanted to explore Nietzsche, but then, as you say, I couldn't find a biography that was of the whole man. And so I decided to write it. And we'll talk more about that later. But the second part of your question, you ask if my work is a wish to see the truth. And yes, it certainly is. Although, of course, Nietzsche was the first person to say that it's very difficult to perceive truth. You know, he said there are no truths, only perspectives. And of course, my perspective on Nietzsche comes more than 100 years after he died. So that makes my work a perspective seen through time. Does that make it more truthful or less truthful? I don't know. But I'd like to quote Nietzsche in his preface to Beyond Good and Evil, when he says, suppose truth to be a woman. And he goes on to say that finding truth is like winning a woman who never wants to be won. And so he's saying, really, it's impossible to find the whole truth. And I love the way that he uses that very simple image to talk about truth, a simple image to make a complicated point. And I think that is what is very, very special about Nietzsche. In my opinion, it's very important not to have an initial idea about your protagonist. I approach all my subjects with an open mind. while of course learning as much about the subject as I possibly can, reading and so on and so forth. But it's important not to think before I start the book whether my protagonist is a hero or a villain or whatever. I keep an open mind. My technique as a biographer is the same technique that people use to make maps. Triangulation, 1, 2, 3 points. I take 3 points, and the first is the internal life, the thoughts. And I find out what's going on in the internal life by discovering what the protagonist is reading, what he's writing in private, his letters, his diaries, and reported conversations. The second point is the events, what's going on in the life at that particular moment. And the third point is the work that is being produced. So take, say, my first subject, Edvard Munch, the Scream. The thoughts, he was inspired by reading Nietzsche for the first time, reading Zarathustra, God is Dead. And this basically inspired an existential crisis in him. At the same time, his sister was mad. She was shut up in a madhouse that year in Oslo, in the landscape that he's painting. And he went to visit her for the first time. And the madhouse where his sister was next to the slaughterhouse where all the animals were killed in Oslo. And so when he went to visit his mad sister, he could hear the screams of the animals being killed. And of course, the result of this work is the Scream, you know. God is dead. My God, where do we go from here? Nature is screaming, Munch is screaming, everything is screaming. So then, if we take my next subject, Strindberg, it's interesting to take him because his play, his masterpiece, Miss Julie, was also inspired by Nietzsche. But in his case, Strindberg took the idea of the Übermensch and the Untermensch. And he was corresponding with Nietzsche about this. They were writing to each other. And at the time, he was living in a castle, a very strange castle, where the countess seemed to be at the mercy of her servant. So the servant was really the Übermensch and the countess was the Untermensch. And so then he writes his famous tragedy, Miss Julie, where exactly this happens, and the countess ends up killing herself. So then if I can do a third example of this, we get to Nietzsche. And if we take an important event in his life when, as you know, the great love of his life was Lou Andrea Salome, a fantastic femme fatale of her generation, and she rejected him. She wouldn't marry him. He wanted to commit suicide. He had never been so low in all his life. The woman he loved had rejected him. And then the thought is, and this is interesting because it comes first in a private letter that he writes, I must find a way of turning this muck into gold, he says. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So that's his innermost thought, but he turns this and it becomes part of his work. It becomes an aphorism that he puts into his book, The Twilight of the Idols. And of course, it becomes one of his most favorite aphorisms. So those are three examples of what I call triangulation, my technique of biography.
Thank you very much. I think while reading this book, I could not overstate its importance because Nietzsche's life is so contradictory, and his thought is so contradictory that many of the even most important philosophers only take a part of his theory or only a part of his concepts, and they develop them and leave others behind. So is it possible how is it possible to take Nietzsche's life as a whole, and why do you think that we need to know his life as total, to know him as in our map?
Yes, um, you're absolutely right. And I think that the philosophers who take part of his life develop parts very interestingly. I think there's a lot of room for that to happen. But what really gave me the courage to look at his life as a whole in this way that I've just explained is when Nietzsche writes, all philosophy is autobiography. Those are his words. And so the previous biographies have mostly been written by philosophers, concentrating more on the philosophy than the life seen as a whole and in the round. But it was that remark of his, all philosophy is autobiography, that gave me the idea that a biography would shed a different light on the philosophy. Um, and I wanted to get back to him, to his primary sources. Um, and particularly, I don't know if it's the same in Lithuania, but many myths have arisen in the English speaking world about Nietzsche, particularly uh, in England. Nietzsche has been seen as Hitler's philosopher, the philosopher of Nazism. And of course, as you and I know, if you go into his life and his writings, this is very far from the truth. German nationalism was on the rise in his day under Bismarck. He hated it. He hated nationalism in any form. He said, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, that is the end of German philosophy. And I may be a bad German, but I am a good European. He was an internationalist. He loved European culture. Another myth is of Nietzsche, the anti-Semite. And we must admit that this was true during about 5 years when he was very close to Richard Wagner. But apart from that brief period, he had a great, great respect for the Jewish race, and he thought the Jewish race was very important because they didn't have a homeland and they could be detached from the prejudices arising from nationalism. So these were two of the important myths that needed to be examined and challenged and written about.
Yeah. In the beginning of the book, you strongly underline Nietzschean fidelity for the famous sentence of Greek poet Pindar, become such as you are, having learned what that is. Well, having in mind Nietzschean sense of irony, would you agree that Nietzsche's own life, in a very heretic sense, meets that rule?
I, this is the perfect question for a biographer. Um, we have to, yes, I mean, we have to go back to his childhood days, don't we? And you are referring to, I mean, his father was a priest. He came from a very religious family. His mother wished him to become a priest like his father. But of course, Nietzsche's father died when Nietzsche himself was only 4 years old. And the last 2 years of his father's life were terrible. And so Nietzsche saw this man of God suffering for 2 years, and God wasn't helping him. What was God doing? And then, of course, when Nietzsche is 15, Darwin publishes his theory of evolution, and Nietzsche calls it a concept quake, like an earthquake of all thought, because he's really, if not the first, he is among the first to realize the conflict between science and God. and the problems that arise when you put science in the place of God. You know, science has no moral dimension. Also, you know, everyone was crazy about the theory of evolution, but evolution towards what, he asks, you know. Walking upright on two legs is very clever, but it doesn't progress us morally. And so Nietzsche realized then, probably when he was still at school, that what this meant was a complete reassessment. If there's no God, the big questions needed answering. Who am I? What am I? If he was a woman, I mean, I would ask, am I really made from a rib that was taken out of Adam and made into a woman? What am I? What am I doing here? What's the purpose of my life? And these are the very difficult questions that he undertook to answer, learning what he is in order to become who he is. And you could say he devoted his whole life to this. And that's why I place so much importance on Pindar's sentence, become who you are, having learned what that is.
Yeah, and I want to also thank you very much for your answers. And I want to ask you about his illnesses. Is it uh, isn't this illness, and you write a lot about it? Isn't it some determining factor of his work and of his feeling and what the thing that makes him move forward? Because sometimes I feel it is.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for those who don't know about his life, all his life, Nietzsche suffered from very poor health, bad eyesight that eventually led to blindness, and crippling headaches, often from the age of 10, well, yes, the age of 10 onwards. He had to spend whole weeks lying in bed in a darkened room. His eyes hurt so much and his head hurt so much, he says, he couldn't even think. And this continued throughout his life. And this made the intervals of his productivity very short and very intense. And so it led to his technique of writing very short and very intense aphorisms that are intensely memorable. I mean, we've already mentioned whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And of course, this is true of all of us. We apply it to ourselves. But it was particularly true of Nietzsche's own illness. And of course, he turned it into an advantage. The ultimate affirmation of his condition, knowing he's ill, he doesn't complain, he doesn't despair, he doesn't blame his fate, and he carries on working. He uses it to his advantage. He constructs whole books in very short aphorisms and short paragraphs, saying yes to his fate, turning the pain and the sickness into a very fruitful advantage. And also, I mean, he makes a joke of it too. I'd like to quote one of his aphorisms as an example of his humor. He says, only those with very large lungs should be allowed to write long sentences. Great, he's funny. And then there's a more serious one when he says, I am the first German to have mastered the aphorism, and the aphorism is a form of eternity. It's my ambition to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a whole book, and what everyone else does not say in a whole book. And I think he succeeded in that wonderfully. His aphorisms are so famous now.
Yeah, it's all about also the body which thinks, not the head which thinks. It's about all the body. Yeah,
Yes.
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 Talking about music, you write a lot about his relationships with Richard Wagner, which was very very important for him, and also, but not only that, he created music himself. He could talk with many people about music, and in the end, as he was more and more ill, he only wanted to talk with women who
Mm.
like music very much, and and also the myth, and not just the myth, and the truth is that he liked very much to improvise. So it makes me think about Nietzsche like some jazz composer of his times. Would you imagine Friedrich Nietzsche playing alongside playing his piano alongside, for example, Miles Davis or John Coltrane?
I think it's a great idea. Um, yeah, you're absolutely right. Music really well. Nietzsche said, other people need hashish to escape from unbearable pressure. Well, I need the music of Richard Wagner. He loved music. Of course, his father was very musical too, and he grew up with a lot of church music, but he particularly loved Wagner's music, didn't he? And of course, it was music that inspired his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from the Spirit of Music, the book that introduces the concept of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, inspired really by the Dionysian effect of music on him, relating the emotional release of the crowd in mass ecstasy at the festivals of ancient Greece, absolutely like today's pop festivals. And he adored improvising, didn't he? I mean, here in England, in a couple of weeks' time, we've got the Glastonbury Festival. I think he would have. I think he should have played at the Glastonbury Festival. He would have been terrific.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, for me, as for me, I like music very much, so I couldn't. Well, I think our interview will cover the whole of his life, and it is very interesting. And thank you very much. Um, I think the greatest tension, and very, very serious tension in his life, in Nietzsche's life, is religion. And do you think that uh, he took this problem from his home, from his relationships with his mother and his sister? Uh, and do you think that throughout his life he was fit enough to uh, to how to say to struggle with this problem? And do you think he was serious enough in attacking this, or he was, or was he just in the end he says that he says nothing wrong about Jesus Christ, yeah, and he still is developing his idea of early Christianity, which later became the another religion of idols. But yes, what about his religion?
Well, you're absolutely right. He continued continually throughout his life a tremendous respect for Jesus Christ, but he said Jesus Christ was the only true Christian, and of course he did not. He didn't have much respect for the church. He felt that the church had diverged. But you also he advises us to take a hammer to all our idols, doesn't he? I mean, while he loves Christ, he doesn't like he doesn't like the isms. He advises us to take hammer to all our idols, and it's only by examining previous beliefs and seeing if you find them valid that you can discover what you believe. And what you believe, of course, is who you are. We go back to Pindar. But I mean, Nietzsche's always saying, don't define yourself by other people's rules or doctrines. And I think he's extremely interesting as a philosopher because he never makes rules. He thinks of himself as a teacher. And he says in Ecce Homo, you repay a teacher badly by becoming merely a pupil. In other words, you must think beyond your teacher, think beyond Nietzsche, become yourself by thinking beyond him. The second part of your question, was he fit enough for his aim? Well, to be honest, I think it was a very good thing Nietzsche went mad when he did, because if you look at the 2 notebooks for the last book that he was planning, The Will to Power, an attempted transvaluation of all values, that's when he starts to write down rules. But he gave up on writing The Will to Power, and you can see in the notebooks that he scribbled shopping lists and addresses on the manuscript. He'd given it up. Nietzsche was not a rule giver. And I think maybe this is what he realized when he gave up writing The Will to Power. His genius lay in asking questions, not in answering questions, making us think. He wanted us to think for ourselves. He didn't want to put thoughts into our heads. Take a hammer to Plato, take a hammer to God. If they survive your hammer, if you find their precepts ring true, live by them. If not, find your own truth.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's so beautiful. We already spoke a little about women. Do you think Nietzsche is in some way understood women better than his contemporaries?
I think this is absolutely fascinating because he has a terrible reputation for women, doesn't he? People think Nietzsche hated women, but in fact, you have to start with his mother and his sister. They were not happy relationships. His mother was uneducated. She wanted him to go into the church, and I think she was frightened when he started to think independently. And so, but he always cared for his mother, even though they couldn't think similarly. His sister Elizabeth, when they were children, he tried to educate her. He gave her reading lists. She didn't receive an equal education to him, but he thought that she was just as bright, and he wanted her to learn. And that was pretty unusual for the time. And on the whole, of course, Nietzsche adored intelligent women. When he was a university professor at Basel, he voted for women to be admitted as students to the faculty. The vote was turned down, but he wanted that to happen. And he had about 6 friends, close friends, really close friends, who were amongst the early feminists. Cosima Wagner, of course, extremely intelligent, and Malvida von Meysenbug. She was a political activist, a Republican, highly regarded by Garibaldi and Alexander von Herzen. Then there was Rosa von Schönhofer, and Nietzsche encouraged her, and she was the first woman to gain a degree from a Swiss university. Meta von Salis, another close friend. She went to prison in Switzerland because she was campaigning for women to vote, women's suffrage. And of course, last but not least, you have to get to Lou Salome. Very bright indeed. Femme fatale, one of the great fascinators of her generation. Freud fell in love with her, Rainer Maria Rilke. So, in terms of his life and his relationships, certainly he was much, much more open to women than his contemporaries. You could almost call him a feminist, but I'd like to read you a passage that I find extraordinary that a man should write at that time, when he writes in The Gay Science that women are brought up told that sex is shameful and sinful, only to be hurled into marriage and subjected by the man they are taught to worship as a god into the terror and duty of sex. How are they expected to cope with the shocking proximity of man and beast? There, writes Nietzsche, one has tied a psychic knot that has no equal. And here he's prefiguring Freud. I think it's an extraordinarily sensitive observation for a man of his time.
Yeah, I think he is extremely useful to read in a psychoanalytical sense also. Yeah, but thank you for this. Yeah, also feminist inquiries. Yeah. Um, I think what is interesting in that some concepts that we hold still in a mythical sense we understand Nietzsche very wrong when we read him in this very old sense, and we don't retranslate and reaffirm our values ourselves. So what about I think in one of his famous ideas, which is far from understood now, I think it is his idea of eternal return. Don't you think that Nietzsche here gives us good advice for us to take a responsibility for our lives and to affirm life in a way that, for example, psychoanalysts nowadays teach us to struggle with our traumas and symptoms. They said, the healing becomes only then when we go through it ourselves, and we understood that all our black thoughts, all our black desires belong only for us, that we are responsible for them, and only in such a way we can heal. We can become sane, and we can become whole.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely right, Kasparas. The reaffirming and the becoming whole, and what he calls amor fati, as you said, and Nietzsche sometimes calls it his most important thought. So I thought I would read to you, the words that Nietzsche himself says. He writes, "What if some night a demon should creep into your loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once and innumerable times again, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and every sigh and everything unspeakably small or great in your life must return to you in the same succession and sequence. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over and over.'" So basically, it's a thought experiment, isn't it? The eternal recurrence of the same. And I think Nietzsche as you say, before psychoanalysts, before Freud, before Jung. He's warning us against the psychology of regret and self-loathing, what he calls ressentiment, those negative feelings that are to be overcome by the person who takes responsibility for his or her own life. And as we were saying earlier, part of this is not living by somebody else's set of rules, but by finding your own rules, finding who you are, believing what you are, staying true to that, so that if this terrible things happens, and I could think of nothing worse than living my life over and over again, but if that happened, it would not be a source of shame and misery and regret, but I would know that I had taken responsibility for my life, for my fate, for the good things, and particularly for the bad things, and that is something to be proud of.
Yeah, even for example in East Europe, with its terrible history of 20th century, I read about people who lost their parents during the Holocaust, and some of them still say that, all right, I lived my life, it was very poor, it was in many ways, it was horrible, but anyway, I would still like to live it for the second and third time, because there are things that there are people that there are places that you need to go and you want to go,
Mm,
and still it is in your own life, and yeah, it is worth. Thank you
mm,
very much.
yeah,
And
mm,
also, it is very, very close to this question is his concept of affirmation of life. This concept has been quite overlooked by the early researchers, for example, by Heidegger, but gained a lot of positivity after the World War II, as it was scrutinized by famous French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Would you agree with Deleuze's treatment of affirmation as the affirmation of difference which says yes to what is happening in the world, to non-identitarian and multi-perspective forces that form contemporary world? So, was in this sense, Nietzsche is quite different from what they thought him to be. He is very open and he is very global philosopher in this sense. I mean, he speaks about what happens now, and here is his maybe untimely thinking.
yes. You must lead me on this question, Kasparas, because you are the expert on Gilles Deleuze. But so I'll speak a little, but you will probably have more to say about this and correct me if I'm wrong. Um, but I would say that the affirmation of difference is key to Nietzsche's understanding of the world, affirmation of the individual. And indeed, if we think of the individual surviving world wars, as you were talking about, surviving them in the affirmative spirit, again, we can go back to whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We seem to be saying that a lot. Um, and a diversity was something he valued enormously. Um, we'll talk about that later, I think, when we talk about the different species on the earth, when he's talking about looking at the earth from a complete perspective, but that comes later. And of course, diversity, when we remember him saying, I may not be a good German, but I'm a good European. So he's talking about diversity of peoples, of languages, of cultures, but he's basically talking about fruitful diversity. And of course, he's acknowledging diversity when he's talking about truth, challenging us by saying there are no facts, only interpretations. So diversity and individualism, and he's always open to unexpectedly truthful outcomes. But in your question, you ask about non-identitarian and multi-perspective forces that form the contemporary world. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit more about that, if
I think Nietzsche's thought is a thought beyond identity, because always speaks about what forms. Um, Even the first paragraph of his last book, Will to Power, where he speaks about this book, and he speaks about the whole load of chaotic forces, about the chaos which forms this finite forms, about what is becoming. And I think it is also about his fantasy of himself as a Polish, as an inheritor of Polish nobles,
yes,
which is also very interesting in the German society of that time. In the German speaking society of that time, being a Slav meant something which was more minor,
yes,
and also it reminds me a bit of Arthur Rimbaud, a French poet who said that I am not a I am not a white person anymore. If they want to become something different, and this force which makes us different also creates the world of this multi-perspective point of view,
yeah,
creates many worlds and many differences.
yes,
Yeah, so I enjoyed very much this concept of Nietzsche.
yes, yeah.
Um, yes, and the one of his more troubling concepts is the concept of will to power, which he obviously did not match with will to rule, but many of his chauvinist followers of the terrible people of 20th century, and maybe even now, they create this. They want to mold this philosophy into a militant chauvinism, into philosophy of power. But on the other hand, for example, and even anti-colonial, as well as on contemporary anarchist or other social movements who who fight for emancipation all over the world. They also use this will of power, and they understand this will of power as will to emancipation, a will to know the force, a will to know yourself, and a will to know what is happening, and the new. So, do you think that this concept makes us sure that Nietzsche has influenced? He has made lots of difficult,
Yes,
contradictory influence to this stuff.
indeed, indeed, yes. Kaspar, you're so right. Part of the problem, I think, is that Nietzsche was so good with words. And that, of course, because of his illness, he used this technique of the aphorism, the short phrase that says everything. And of course, those few words, those 4 words, can mean anything to anybody, can't they? Anyone can take the will to power, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, anarchist, authoritarian. And of course, that makes it all the more important to go back to his original sources. We talked a bit about his book, The Will to Power. But of course, the problem, parts of it, as published, are written by Nietzsche, but other parts, after he went mad, his sister Elizabeth, who was basically a Nazi and a great friend of Hitler and of Mussolini. Indeed, Hitler even came to her funeral, which he didn't do to many people because that was very bad public relations to be photographed at a funeral. But he came to Hitler's funeral and he's photographed there. He called her the mother of the nation. Anyway, she corrupted Nietzsche's text of The Will to Power, and she filled it with some of her own Nazi opinions. And so in Elizabeth's version, The Will to Power becomes the victory of nationalism and brutality and colonialism and exploitation and racism, etc. And of course, that is very difficult. But I think that what we can say when we talk about Nietzsche in a political context is that Nietzsche was not actually interested in political movements. His interest was in the construction of the individual, not how to live your life, how to overcome, become yourself, love your fate. So I don't think the concept of the will to power is political. There's a place where he says simply, the will is the life force. So it's the baby asserting its will, keeping alive. He also talks about the will to power as the processes of nature. It's water wearing away a stone. So there's the natural will to power, but I think, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, there is the conscious will to power as well. But that is, as Nietzsche is talking about it, it's not about oppressing other people. It's about self-mastery, self-overcoming, and overcoming, all the urges to regret, revenge, ressentiment, the will to power to become a yes-sayer, to affirm life, power over yourself through knowing yourself and celebrating your life, and indeed celebrating the life of the planet, the life of the world.
We Lithuanians need more will to power because in our country many people are still suffering from their from their own past traumas and their own past bad memories, and sometimes we are trying to master these things by overthinking and reflecting on what is happening in our political, for example. Yeah. Um, but the next thing is more pikant, I think. Pikant. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this topic of overvaluation of morals. Because, as Nietzsche wrote his work, he I think many people understood it as becoming a moralist, very much about destroying all the possible morals, which was not very much only about Nietzsche, because it was also about if you read Dostoevsky closely, or if you read Russian anarchists closely, they spoke about such things themselves. But what do you think about today? For example, we've had this 70s with sexual revolution or valuing of morals in a very strong sense. And then now, for example, we have this new moral ideas about women, about Me Too, about all these problems. How do you think, is it still does it still overvalue all the morals, or is it another oscillation that still needs to be somehow always uh, undermined and a bit is their revolution of Morris still needed now?
Wow, my goodness, Kaspar, that's a difficult question. I like your use of the word oscillation. You're so right. Morals swing from one side to the other, don't they? I'm not an expert on sex or gender. I'm older than you are, so I have seen more oscillations. I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother. I've been married to the same man for 40 years. I've been faithful and I've been happy. So that's me. But that doesn't mean I think it's the only right path. Um, as a biographer, I know there are many paths. It seems to me that this oscillation we are going through, I think we have to find the answer where we should always find the answer to this, which is an acknowledgement of diversity, but not to make an aggressive thing out of it, to understand tolerance, mutual respect. At the moment, I think people are having a fight. It's all getting much too like that. It'll calm down, and it should. Um, it's never fruitful to be aggressive, I think. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much, Sue. Uh, yeah, the last thing, the last concept is Übermensch. It is a very difficult concept, but also difficult that it speaks about our destiny. What do you think is a destiny of a human being today? If we think about all these Anthropocene scenarios and other end of the world scenarios, is there some Ubermensch that we make of ourselves to save ourselves, or do we need a savior, or do we need
I I think we can do it by ourselves. I think we are the Übermensch. We must be the Übermensch. We we're capable of taking responsibility for the earth. We must. We have all these problems, global warming, climate change, let alone nuclear problems. We won't speak about them, but the natural problems that we ourselves have created. We must be affirmative. We must affirm what has happened and affirm we can do something about it. Nietzsche, in fact, was very inspired by the natural world, as you know. You know, mountains and forests inspired his most life-affirming ideas, and he was full of awe for nature. And in fact, I mean, what's interesting is that in 1882, he decided that he needed to know more about the natural world to examine the anthropomorphic fallacy, the idea that everything is around human beings, that we are the center of the earth. And in 1882, he had the idea that natural phenomena should not be viewed from the short-sighted, narrowly human perspective. And to this end, he decided he wanted to go to Paris or to Vienna to study natural sciences for 4 or 5 years. Well, he never did that. That never happened. But what remained, I think, in his head was the idea that philosophical conclusions should be related to empirical observation and to experiment. And, he emphasizes that we are only part of the whole picture of nature, only a cog in the machine. We're not gods. Try looking at the world from a frog's perspective, he says. And I think if he were alive now, he'd be marching. He'd be the first to take affirmative action for the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and going, and turning our eye to what is happening now, Nietzsche's concept of a blonde beast became notorious, and it still is. And do you think that it is the dangerous gap that we still face today in the threat of war and in the absurd nuclear collapse, as it also threatened? How do you think Nietzsche would react to the real danger that his books are famous for glorifying? What is the place that he wouldn't go in his real life, because he went mad, and he went mad in the moment where what he said was going to happen to himself. It blasted him, and
Yes.
it was a huge. Yeah. And what do you think uh, he would keep us aware, and what do you think he would tell us not to?
Well, you're right about identifying the blonde beast, and it's probably the most notorious misunderstanding of Nietzsche's writings. But I want to read. He wrote. He realized the problems that could happen after his time. Nietzsche wrote, "I am frightened by the thought of what unqualified and unsuitable people may invoke my authority one day. Yet that is the torment of every teacher of mankind. He knows that given the circumstances and accidents of history, he may become a curse as well as a blessing to mankind." So that's what he wrote about that. And of course, in the light of that, we should examine exactly what Nietzsche meant when he wrote about the blonde beast. In Nietzsche's writings, there are 5 mentions of the blonde beast. And in fact, they occur when he is speculating on prehistory, on how the first nation states began, when the first men came out of caves and forests and organized into tribes. When the strong man took charge, like a lion coming out of the forest and organizing the other men. That's where the blonde beast comes from. It's a metaphor for the lion. It's not a racial characteristic. And again, I quote, Roman, Arabian, German, Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings. In this requirement, all are alike. It was the noble races that left the concept of the barbarian in their wake. The highest culture betrays the fact that they were conscious of this and proud of this. So it's not a racial thing, but a cultural thing. His inclusion of the Arabs and the Japanese shows that, because they are not, after all, blonde. The blonde beast is the early man who civilizes the barbarians through force, and it's an historical description. When Nietzsche writes about the blonde beast, you have to take it in the context. He's looking backwards and not forwards. Of course, the reinterpretation of the blonde beast is due to Nietzsche's dreadful sister Elizabeth corrupting his ideas. And because of this, the blonde beast has come to be synonymous with warfare and warriors. But it's interesting, as I said, that Nietzsche foresaw that his words could be misunderstood. But so also did one of the critics who wrote a review of Beyond Good and Evil, which is the book in which the blonde beast makes its entrance. And this is a critic called Wiedemann, and he's writing in Der Bund in 1886. And he says about the book, "The stocks of dynamite used in the building of the St. Gotthard Tunnel were marked by a black flag indicating mortal danger. Exclusive in this sense do we speak of the new book by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche as a dangerous book. Intellectual explosives, like the material sort, can serve very useful purposes, but there is dynamite here. Nietzsche is the first man to blast his way through, but it is such a terrifying way that one is really frightened to see him walking this lonely, until now untrodden path." And Nietzsche treasured this description of his thought as dynamite, as powerful as dynamite. He liked that. He said, "I'm not a man, I am dynamite." And so it seemed the right title for my book.
But I think we can understand dynamite here not only as a terrible weapon, but also as a thing that may explode the rocks to unblock the walls. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he is, I think, dynamite and such in this way. Thank you
Yes.
very much. If we speak about Nietzschean ideas that all moral values should be outvalued, overvalued, and then I think there are many people in the 20th century who want to overvalue these old values, and when they speak about old values, they speak about, for example, values of enlightenment, values of that all the people can be and must be rational, about
Mhm.
that all we need is a kind of consensus in what we do in our society. What is valuable, that it should be democratic and in many senses. But do you think that we can keep these values, but also to make kind of small experiments about how we can live in another way? How can we undermine a little bit some ideas about what is valuable in this society, to make small for example, different experiments in creating different kinds of societies, small places and small utopias, which could be still in line with which would be not about dynamiting everything around, but about living in a more powerful and pleasant way.
I think, yes, absolutely. I think we should all, in our homes, in our families, in our friends, in our surroundings, we should all live what I would call a permeable life. We should have permeable borders. Yes. So I mean, of course, we must all live within certain laws, mustn't we? thou shalt not kill. That's a pretty good one. But yes, and Nietzsche would be the first to approve of experimental living. That surely is always the way you go forward. You can never go, well, as he said, the snake that cannot shed its skin dies. So we must shed our skin continually, always be open to change, always think, oh, wow, am I doing it the right way? Is there a better way I can do it? Can I learn from somebody else? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also, Nietzsche always thinks about himself as a radical aristocrat. I think I understand a radical aristocracy, for example, of people who are not bound by their interests and who can share everything around themselves, to throw everything around,
Hmm.
And was Nietzsche such an aristocrat? And was he? Do you think um, he also?
I do. I'm thinking, to give birth to a dancing star, you must first have chaos within. Um, the creativity that flows from that, um, and you're right. It is aristocracy of the spirit, isn't it? Aristocracy of the soul, which generosity and affirmation. Be noble, generous, and brave. And obviously, he didn't think much of the herd mentality and the herd spirit, because he thought that was, you've got to risk danger to play a part in your obligations of society. I mean, an example, I think, of his um, nobility actually was, when he goes to war, when he in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. He didn't want to go to war. He loved France. He thought it was terrible that Germany was going to war with France. He loved both countries. And then he was working in Basel in Switzerland. And the Swiss didn't want him to go to war. He had to get special permission. But he thought, I can't just sit here while other people are fighting. That's a terrible thing. But he didn't want to go as a soldier. And so he volunteered as a medical orderly, and he went to the terrible battlefields, looked after the wounded and the dying, and he himself caught diphtheria and dysentery, and he nearly died. But he had done his duty. He had done something. I think that was the action of a radical aristocrat who feels he must get involved. You can't just stand to the side and let it all happen.
Yeah, yeah. Um, we didn't yet talk about city in Nietzsche's life and his theory. I like your description of Turin when he came to Turin and he saw the city, and it was so pleasant and it was so noble, like a theater. These squares were empty, and and at the same time, there is a Nietzsche who is waiting for barbarians, and he is sometimes he in this contrast. I would see him as a city philosopher of the contemporary, in the contemporary sense, because it is always this area and events which happen in this area that make this city alive. Recently I was in Paris, and it was I lived some time in a very very high bourgeois part of the city, and then I went to a uh, very popular part of the
mm,
city near
mm,
Place Republique. And there are many demonstrations and happenings, and
mm,
there are many poor people living around, and and that made me the sense of life. Something is happening. Uh,
mm.
do you think Nietzsche would agree that what is different, what is most valuable in the cities is this, on the other hand, is contrast, is difference.
Mm, mm, mm. Yes, I, I, I love your description. The city is theatre, and of course, it's a theatre of contrasts, isn't it? I mean, it's the contrasts that make the stimulation of the city, isn't it? The slums and the palaces. And Nietzsche loved contrast. He loved the wild and the tame, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. He loved the highest intellectual standards, and he loved danger. He said, build your houses on the slopes of Vesuvius. He loved intellectual danger. I think I think Nietzsche would love every city that is in the avant-garde of its time. Paris in the 1890s, Tokyo today, historic culture rubbing shoulders with all the trash, with all the neon tattoo parlors and nonsense. I think he enjoyed all that, actually. What do you think? Maybe he would like best to have gone back to Athens in the days of the ancient Greeks. Do you think that would have been his favorite city?
Yeah, I think. I think he maybe would like to go to the Athens now, as
Yeah.
yeah, many people are struggling, and
Yes.
my
Yeah.
friend who is a theater director
Yeah.
told me a story about how refugees are being saved in Athens by the whole city. The people who have shops open shops for those people, and they invite people to sit outside to eat, and it's a generosity, but not all the people
No.
now can live up to it.
Mm, mm, mm.
And these days in Europe can be still named the tragic age of Europe, the age of absurd wars and nuclear threats. What kind of book would Nietzsche have written, do you think, were he to live in our age? Which ideas would have he developed more? Which of his ideas you think are still alive and thinkable? Which of his ideas are still misunderstood? And which of his aims and ideals are still out of our reach?
Well, it's a very big question. Um, we've talked a bit about his ideas. Let's talk about the unwritten books. I I won't speculate on unwritten books. I'll give you a Nietzschean answer to this question: the eternal recurrence of the same, because I don't think we need any new books by Nietzsche. I think if we read what we have, he was the first philosopher of the modern world. When he was writing, he felt he was present at the destruction of one world and the opening chapter of the next. And I think a lot of people feel the same today. And so I think that's why people are finding real personal meaning in his books. So I don't think he needs to write any new ones, because in fact, we are living the eternal recurrence of the same questions. He raised the big questions that, in fact, we're still thinking about. We go back to the beginning. Is there a metaphysical meaning to life? If there's not, if God is dead, what matters? what's it mean to be human? If you're unchanged from a metaphysical purpose, how then do you find meaning in your life? And these are Nietzsche's recurring questions, and I don't think anyone has answered them yet, and they remain thoroughly modern challenge to us all. So thank you, Nietzsche, for asking us all these questions. And thank you, Kasparas. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Nisu. It was absolutely fascinating from my side to have you as a discussant. Is there something that you would like to develop which we didn't speak about? Maybe there is something that you would like to say more about his.
No, except I really want to get to Lithuania. I would love to come. I've read so much about your country, and I'm so sad that I can't actually come in person to your festival. But believe it or not, when it's going on, I shall be in Tahiti, um, researching my next book, which is very exciting in itself. But I'm sorry not to meet you in person, and sorry not to come to your wonderful country.
Very sad about not meeting you in person too, because it would be interesting to and Klaipėda, where we could meet, but maybe we will still meet. Yeah,
Someday.
and it is a very interesting city because it is a former German city, has a lot of famous,
Mm,
memories from
mm,
the years, and also this memory of the destruction which happened after the Second World War, this all victory and the fall, everything is
yeah.
very close. Everything is very close, and still, I think that many problems today are rising out from not reading Nietzsche well, not reading him,
Yes,
not,
yes,
not
yes.
reading him seriously, because
Mm,
by the way, the first idea that I had about Nietzsche was that my mother used to talk used to tell me about his university her university friends who used to
yeah.
read Nietzsche a lot, and then they struggled. They beat each other. They used to beat each other, but maybe maybe every things will be serene
Yeah.
after this conversation. Maybe, but yeah, I would recommend everybody to read your book, and I did it with a huge with a very much pleasure. Yeah. Thank you a lot, and thank you for this conversation a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kasparas. Thank you. Lovely.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.